June 6, 1944, and Lieutenant Robert Hayes stands in the pre-dawn darkness of a Higgins boat, surrounded by 30 young men who are about to face what historians will later call the longest day, though for many of them it will be the shortest and last day of their lives, as they prepare to assault Omaha Beach in what will become the most critical amphibious invasion in human history. An operation that will determine the fate of Europe and possibly the entire world, though in this moment none of them are thinking about grand strategy or historical significance. They are thinking about not drowning in the cold waters of the English Channel, about the 80 pounds of equipment strapped to their bodies that will drag them straight to the bottom if they fall into water over their heads, about whether they will be brave enough when the ramp drops and German machine guns open fire, and about the simple animal desire to survive the next few hours. Robert is 23 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who joined the Army in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, spent 2 years training for this single moment, learned to lead men and make split-second decisions that mean life or death, and now commands a platoon of the 29th Infantry Division, the blue and gray division they call it, though there is nothing colorful or romantic about what they are about to do. Just cold water and hot metal and young men dying far from home. He looks at the faces around him in the dim light provided by the moon filtering through broken clouds, sees Private Tommy Sullivan from Boston who talks too much when he is nervous and has not stopped talking since they loaded into this boat 3 hours ago, sees Corporal James Martinez from Texas who sits perfectly still with his eyes closed either praying or trying not to vomit from the violent pitching of the boat in heavy seas. Sees Sergeant Bill Anderson from Pennsylvania who has been in the Army since 1940 and is the oldest man in the platoon at 32 years old, a combat veteran from North Africa who knows what is coming and whose grim silence speaks louder than any words could. The boat rises and falls on 6-foot swells, and men vomit over the sides or into their helmets, or simply down the fronts of their uniforms because there is nowhere else for it to go, and the acrid smell of vomit mixes with the salt spray and diesel fumes and the metallic taste of fear that seems to coat everything. Robert checks his watch for the 20th time in the last hour, sees that it is 05:30 hours, knows that H hour is set for 06:30, which means they have exactly 1 hour left before the ramp drops and their fate is decided. And he wonders if the Navy bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German defenses has actually accomplished anything or if they are about to hit a fully intact Atlantic wall defended by troops who have had 4 years to prepare for this exact moment. The sound of the naval bombardment has been continuous for the past hour, a rolling thunder that seems to shake the very air, as battleships and cruisers and destroyers pour thousands of tons of high-explosive shells onto the French coast, and the men in the Higgins boat take comfort from this awesome display of firepower, believing that nothing could survive such a bombardment, that the Germans must all be dead or running inland in panic. Though Robert has heard enough stories from Sergeant Anderson about North Africa to know that concrete and steel can protect men from almost anything, and that German soldiers have a disturbing habit of surviving bombardments that should have killed them 10 times over and then emerging from their bunkers ready to fight with a skill and determination that has made them the most formidable army in the world. As dawn begins to break, turning the sky from black to gray, Robert can see the coast of France ahead, can make out the dark line of cliffs rising behind the beach, can see the church steeple in Vierville that they were shown in the briefing, and the sight of actual land after hours of seeing nothing but water brings a strange mix of relief and terror because this means it is real, this is actually happening. They are actually going to do this thing that seemed abstract and unreal during all those months of training. He thinks about the briefing they received yesterday on the transport ship, about the officers pointing to maps and aerial photographs and explaining that Omaha Beach is divided into sectors with code names like Easy Red and Fox Green, that his platoon will land on Dog White sector near a draw called D1 that provides access from the beach to the clifftops. That German defenses consist of concrete bunkers mounting 75mm guns and 88mm guns and machine gun nests and mortar pits and extensive minefields and obstacles, but that these defenses should be suppressed by the bombardment, and that resistance will be light to moderate. Light to moderate, Robert thinks, and wants to laugh at the absurdity of that phrase, as if there is something moderate about men trying to kill you with machine guns and artillery, as if death and dismemberment can be measured on some bureaucratic scale of intensity. He remembers the colonel who gave the briefing saying that casualties were expected to be around 10%, which seemed reasonable when sitting safely on a transport ship looking at maps, but which now feels like a death sentence because 10% means 3 men from this boat will not make it off the beach alive, and every man here is doing the same math and wondering if he will be one of the 3. And Robert knows that the actual number will probably be much higher because colonels always underestimate casualties and because Murphy's Law states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and in amphibious assaults against fortified positions everything can go wrong. The boat begins to slow as it approaches the shore, and Robert can hear the sound of machine gun fire now, a distant chattering that sounds almost harmless until you remember that each burst represents dozens of bullets traveling at supersonic speeds and capable of tearing human flesh apart like tissue paper. He sees other Higgins boats ahead of them, sees one take a direct hit from an artillery shell and simply disintegrate in a flash of orange flame and black smoke, sees another reach the beach and drop its ramp and watches as machine gun fire cuts down every man trying to exit, sees bodies floating face down in water that is turning red with blood, and realizes with absolute clarity that the briefing was wrong. That German defenses are not suppressed, that resistance is not light to moderate. That they are heading straight into a killing zone where survival will be a matter of pure luck rather than training or courage or anything else they were taught. The boat coxswain is screaming something about obstacles, about the tide being wrong, about landing in the wrong sector. But his words are lost in the overwhelming noise of machine guns and artillery, and the diesel engine and men yelling and the voice in Robert's head that is calmly noting that he is about to die on a beach in France at 23 years old without ever getting married or having children or doing any of the things he thought he would do with his life. He turns to face his men, sees the same realization in their eyes, knows that he needs to say something, anything, to give them courage for what comes next. But every inspirational phrase he rehearsed during the crossing suddenly seems hollow and meaningless when measured against the reality of what they are facing. "Listen up!" Robert shouts, and is surprised that his voice sounds calm and steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "When that ramp drops, you get off this boat as fast as you possibly can, because this boat is a death trap and the only way to survive is to get to the seawall at the base of the cliffs. Don't bunch up, spread out, move fast, and if someone goes down keep moving because stopping gets you killed. We trained for this, we can do this, and I will see every one of you on top of those cliffs. Now check your weapons and get ready." The men check their M1 Garans and bars and carbines with hands that are shaking from cold and fear, and Robert checks his own carbine and then his pistol and then the grenades on his webbing, going through the familiar routine that has been drilled into him through hundreds of hours of training, and the routine is comforting in its familiarity even though he knows that combat is nothing like training. That all the rehearsals and practice assaults and lectures cannot prepare you for the reality of men trying to kill you. The boat lurches to a stop as it hits a sandbar about 50 yards from the beach, much further out than it was supposed to land, and the coxswain is yelling that he cannot get any closer, that this is as far as he goes, and Robert realizes that his men are going to have to wade through 50 yards of waist-deep water while being shot at, that the 80 pounds of equipment each man carries will slow them down and make them perfect targets, that some of them will step into holes or shell craters, and drown before they even reach the beach. He makes a split-second decision that probably saves lives, yelling for everyone to ditch their packs and keep only weapons and ammunition, and men frantically unbuckle and drop the heavy packs that contain rations and spare uniforms and personal items, lightening their load by 40 pounds and increasing their chances of survival by some unknowable percentage. The ramp drops with a metallic clang that seems impossibly loud, and Robert gets his first clear view of Omaha Beach, and what he sees will haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The beach is 400 yards of open sand with absolutely no cover, rising gradually to a seawall and then steep cliffs beyond, and every inch of that 400 yards is covered by German machine guns firing from concrete bunkers that the naval bombardment failed to destroy. The water is full of obstacles, steel beams and wooden posts and concrete tetrahedrons designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, and many of these obstacles have mines attached to them, and the tide is rising, which means the obstacles will soon be underwater and even more dangerous. Bodies float everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, soldiers from the first wave who landed 20 minutes ago and were slaughtered before they could get off the beach, and the water is pink with blood, and the sound of bullets hitting water sounds like rain except faster and more violent. Robert jumps off the ramp into water that is chest deep and so cold it drives the air from his lungs, and immediately realizes he has stepped into a shell crater because the water is over his head and his helmet and weapon are dragging him down, and he kicks desperately for the surface, breaks through gasping and choking, flounders toward shallower water where he can touch bottom. Around him men are doing the same desperate dance, some making it to shallow water, others disappearing beneath the surface and not coming back up, and Robert sees Private Johnson from Ohio sink like a stone and knows the kid is dead, drowned before he ever fired his weapon, 20 years old and dead in 6 feet of water 50 yards from France. Machine gun bullets are hitting the water all around them, making little splashes that seem almost decorative until you realize each splash represents a bullet that could have killed you, and Robert hears the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to his head, a sound like someone snapping a whip next to your ear. And he is wading as fast as he can toward the beach, but the water is like trying to run through molasses, and he feels completely exposed and helpless. Sergeant Anderson is beside him, weapon held high, face grim but determined, and on his other side Private Sullivan is still talking, a continuous stream of profanity that would be funny in any other context but here serves as proof that he is still alive, still functioning despite the terror. They reach the edge of the water and Robert throws himself onto the wet sand, and the sand provides no cover whatsoever, but at least he is out of the water, at least he can move faster now, and he looks back and sees that maybe 20 of his 30 men made it out of the water, the other 10 either drowned or hit in that terrible wade from the boat to the beach. The seawall is 200 yards ahead, an impossible distance that might as well be 200 miles, and between here and there is open sand swept by machine gun fire so intense that the air itself seems solid with bullets. Robert knows they cannot stay here, knows that staying in the open means dying, and he screams for his men to move and starts crawling forward on his belly, using elbows and knees to propel himself across sand that is littered with bodies and equipment and debris. Every few yards he encounters another dead man, sometimes someone from his boat, sometimes from another unit, and he crawls over or around these bodies that were living human beings minutes ago, tries not to look at their faces, tries not to think about the fact that he might join them at any second. Corporal Martinez is crawling beside him, and they are making eye contact, and Martinez is saying something when the top of his head simply explodes in a spray of blood and bone and brain matter, and Robert watches the light go out of Martinez's eyes in an instant, watches him go from living person to corpse in the time it takes a bullet to travel from a German machine gun to a human skull. Robert keeps crawling, there is nothing else to do. Stopping means dying, and he is crying now, tears mixing with seawater and sweat, and the blood that seems to be on everything, and he does not know if he is crying from fear or grief or rage or just the sheer overwhelming horror of what is happening. The seawall seems to be getting further away rather than closer, and time has become meaningless, minutes feel like hours, and Robert has no idea how long he has been crawling, knows only that his elbows and knees are raw and bleeding, that his muscles are screaming with exhaustion, that he has emptied his canteen and is desperately thirsty despite being soaked to the skin. Explosions bracket him as German mortars walk across the beach, and one lands close enough to shower him with sand and pebbles, and his ears are ringing so loudly he cannot hear anything else, and for a moment he thinks he has been hit, does a frantic inventory of his body, decides he is still intact though covered in other people's blood. Private Sullivan appears beside him, still alive somehow, face blackened with smoke and sand, and Sullivan is laughing, a high-pitched hysterical laugh that sounds like madness, and maybe it is madness because no sane person could experience this and remain sane, and Robert finds himself laughing too, and the two of them crawl forward laughing like lunatics while men die around them and machine guns chatter, and the world comes apart. Sergeant Anderson materializes on his other side, not laughing but grinning a death's head grin that is somehow more disturbing than Sullivan's hysteria, and Anderson yells, "Just like Kasserine!" which is a reference to a battle in North Africa that Robert knows nothing about except that it was a disaster, and Anderson seems to find this comparison hilarious. They reach the seawall after what feels like hours but is probably only 10 minutes, and Robert collapses against the blessed concrete that provides the first real cover since they left the boat, and other men are pressing up against the wall, maybe 40 or 50 soldiers from different units all mixed together, and Robert does a quick count and realizes he has 8 men left from his original 30. 8 out of 30 in 10 minutes, and the math is so terrible that he cannot process it. Cannot accept that 22 men who were alive and talking and joking an hour ago are now dead, their bodies scattered across the beach or floating in the water or simply gone, vaporized by artillery shells. But there is no time to process losses, no time to grieve, because they are still in a killing zone even behind the seawall. German mortars are dropping shells on this position, and staying here means dying just slower than staying in the open. Robert looks up at the cliffs rising behind the seawall, sees German soldiers moving in the bunkers and trenches, sees the muzzle flashes of machine guns, realizes that they need to get up those cliffs and kill those Germans, or they will all die here on this beach. He gathers his surviving men, finds soldiers from other units who have lost their officers, organizes them into a makeshift assault team, and realizes with a strange sense of detachment that he is now responsible for the lives of men he has never met, men whose names he does not know but who are looking to him for leadership. Engineers appear with Bangalore torpedoes, long metal tubes filled with explosives designed to clear wire obstacles and mines, and they push these tubes under the barbed wire that blocks access to the cliff path, and there is a tremendous explosion that blows a gap in the defenses, and Robert knows this is their moment, their only chance, that they need to move now before the Germans recover from the explosion. He stands up, which feels insane after spending the last forever flat on his belly, and waves his arm and screams, "Follow me!" and starts running up the cliff path without looking back to see if anyone is following, because if he looks back he might see that no one is following, and then he would lose his nerve. But men are following, he can hear boots behind him, can hear voices yelling, and he is running up a narrow path between minefields with machine gun bullets cracking past and mortars exploding, and the knowledge that every step might trigger a mine or bring a bullet, but also the knowledge that stopping means dying and forward is the only direction that matters. The path zigzags up the cliff face, and Robert hugs the slope, using whatever cover is available, and men are falling behind him. He hears screams and sees soldiers tumble back down the path, but others keep coming, keep pushing forward, and the momentum builds and becomes irresistible. They reach a German trench line, and Robert jumps in without thinking, finds himself face to face with a German soldier who looks as terrified as Robert feels, and they both fire simultaneously, and Robert feels bullets pass so close they pluck at his uniform, but somehow he is not hit, and the German soldier goes down, and Robert keeps moving through the trench, firing at anything that moves, throwing grenades into bunkers. And other Americans are pouring into the trench now, and it becomes a brutal close-quarters fight with bayonets and rifle butts and knives and grenades, and Robert kills 3 more men in ways that will give him nightmares for decades, but in the moment there is no time for thought or reflection, just survival instinct and training taking over. They capture the bunker that has been firing on Dog White Sector, find the machine gun crew dead from grenades, and Robert looks out the firing slit and sees Omaha Beach spread below him, and the sight makes his stomach turn. The beach is covered with bodies, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and more boats are still coming in, disgorging more men into the slaughter, and Robert realizes that D-Day is succeeding not because of good planning or adequate preparation, but because American soldiers are willing to walk into machine gun fire and keep coming even as their friends die beside them, because there are more Americans than there are German bullets. And this is a mathematics of horror that he will never be able to explain to anyone who was not here. The fight for the cliff top continues for hours, a confused melee of small unit actions, soldiers from a dozen different units fighting under whoever happens to be closest with officer rank, and Robert finds himself commanding a company-sized force of men from the 29th Division and the 1st Division and the Rangers and even some Navy personnel who somehow ended up on the beach with rifles. They push inland, clearing bunkers and trenches, and German resistance begins to crumble as the defenders are overwhelmed by numbers and firepower, and by mid-afternoon they have pushed nearly a mile inland and established a tenuous foothold, though the beachhead is much smaller and has cost far more casualties than anyone predicted. As evening falls on the longest day, Robert sits in a captured German bunker and tries to write a letter to his mother on a piece of German stationery, but his hands are shaking too badly to hold the pencil, and besides he has no idea what he would say, no words that could describe what happened here today, no way to explain how he survived when so many others did not. Sergeant Anderson sits beside him, methodically cleaning his rifle, and Sullivan is curled in a corner sleeping the sleep of utter exhaustion, and Private Chin from California, who joined the platoon somewhere during the assault, is standing watch at the bunker entrance, and these 3 men plus 5 others are all that remain of Robert's platoon and the 40-odd soldiers he collected during the assault. Someone brings rations, cold sea rations that taste like cardboard, but Robert eats mechanically because his body needs fuel even if his mind has shut down, and he shares a cigarette with Anderson even though he does not smoke, and the nicotine makes him dizzy but also provides a brief escape from the memories that are already forming, the images that will replay in his mind's eye for the rest of his life. Anderson tells him that he did good today, that he kept men alive who would have died without leadership, and Robert wants to believe this but can only think about the 22 men from his original platoon who died, wonders if he could have saved them if he had made different decisions, given different orders, chosen a different route up the beach. "You did what you could," Anderson says, reading his thoughts. "Everyone who made it off that beach alive owes their life to luck more than anything else. I've been in 3 amphibious assaults now, and this was the worst by far. The fact that any of us are alive is a miracle." Robert nods but does not feel reassured, knows that survivor's guilt is already taking root in his mind, that he will spend years wondering why he lived when better men died, men with families waiting for them, men who deserve to survive more than a 23-year-old farm boy from Iowa who has nothing and no one depending on him. But there is no time for philosophy or introspection, because a runner arrives with orders for the next day, instructions to push further inland, to link up with paratroopers, to expand the beachhead, and Robert realizes that D-Day is over but the war is not, that tomorrow they will do this again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until either the Germans are defeated or he is killed. He tries to sleep but cannot, lies in the darkness listening to the sounds of wounded men crying for medics, listening to sporadic gunfire as nervous sentries fire at shadows, listening to the rumble of artillery that never completely stops, and he thinks about Omaha Beach and the men who died there, thinks about the farm in Iowa that seems to belong to a different lifetime. Thinks about whether he will live to see the end of this war or whether he will join Martinez and Sullivan's brother and Private Johnson and all the others who died today, and eventually exhaustion overwhelms even fear and grief and he falls into a dreamless sleep that is interrupted by nightmares of drowning and machine guns and men with their heads exploding, nightmares that will recur for the next 60 years until he dies as an old man still haunted by the morning when he waded ashore on Omaha Beach and walked through hell and somehow emerged alive. The days after D-Day blur together into a continuous nightmare of combat, and exhaustion and death, as Robert's makeshift company pushes inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, and he learns that the Bocage country with its ancient stone walls and dense vegetation is perfect defensive terrain where a handful of German soldiers can hold up an entire American battalion for hours. Where every field is a potential ambush site and every hedgerow conceals German machine guns and Panzerfausts, and where progress is measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles and paid for in American casualties that mount steadily day after day. Robert fights through this green hell for 6 weeks, leading attacks on villages with names he cannot pronounce, clearing bunkers and farmhouses, and watching the remnants of his platoon dwindle as men are killed or wounded or simply break down from the strain of continuous combat. And by the time the breakout from Normandy finally comes in late July, he is one of only 3 survivors from the original 30 men who landed with him on Omaha Beach, and he has been promoted to captain and given command of a company because so many officers have been killed that the army is promoting anyone who is still alive and still functional regardless of whether they feel ready for the responsibility. Robert participates in the liberation of Paris in August, and riding through the streets of the French capital with crowds cheering and throwing flowers and pretty girls kissing every American soldier they can reach should be one of the happiest moments of his life. But instead he feels numb and disconnected, cannot share in the celebration because he is thinking about the men who died to make this moment possible. thinking about Sullivan and Martinez and Anderson and all the others who will never see Paris, who will never see anything again, and the contrast between the joy of the liberated Parisians and his own emotional emptiness makes him realize that something fundamental has broken inside him, that the war has damaged him in ways that may never heal. He fights through the fall and winter of 1944, crosses into Germany in early 1945, and is part of the force that liberates one of the concentration camps, and the sights he sees there, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale, the emaciated prisoners who are barely alive, the piles of bodies and the gas chambers and the crematoriums, these sights both horrify him and vindicate him. Make him understand that this war was necessary and just, that whatever price was paid in American lives was worth paying to defeat a regime capable of such monstrous evil. Robert Hayes is in central Germany when the war ends on May 8, 1945, and the news brings a sense of relief so overwhelming that he breaks down and cries for the first time since Omaha Beach, cries for all the men who did not live to see this day, cries for the innocence he lost and can never recover. Cries for the simple fact that he has survived nearly a year of combat, and can now go home and try to rebuild a life from the wreckage of the person he used to be. He receives his discharge in October 1945, returns to Iowa with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and a Silver Star and a head full of memories that he wishes he could forget, and he tries to pick up the threads of his pre-war life. But everything has changed, he has changed, and the farm that seemed like the entire world before he joined the army now feels small and confining. And the people who never left Iowa cannot understand what he has been through, and he cannot explain it to them, and he feels like an alien visiting a place that was once home but is home no longer. He enrolls in college on the GI Bill, studies agriculture, and buries himself in his coursework because focusing on soil chemistry and crop rotation keeps him from thinking about Omaha Beach and keeps the nightmares at bay at least during his waking hours. He meets a woman, Mary, who is studying to be a teacher, and she is patient with his silences and his occasional moments of dissociation when a loud noise makes him dive for cover, and he loves her for her patience and her refusal to ask questions about things he cannot talk about, and they marry in 1947 and have 3 children, and Robert builds a life that from the outside looks normal and successful. Career as an agricultural extension agent, house in a good neighborhood, children who do well in school, all the markers of post-war American prosperity. But inside Robert Hayes there is a wound that never heals, a place where Omaha Beach lives in permanent memory, where he is always 23 years old and crawling across sand while men die around him, where Martinez's head is always exploding in slow motion, where the seawall is always impossibly far away, and this place in his mind is always accessible, always ready to drag him back. And certain triggers can transport him there instantly. The smell of diesel fuel, the sound of firecrackers, the sight of red water, and when this happens he becomes briefly unable to distinguish past from present, becomes that terrified lieutenant again, and his family learns to recognize the signs and give him space until he comes back to himself. In the years after the war, Robert Hayes will rarely speak about D-Day, will deflect questions from his children and grandchildren, will change the subject when people thank him for his service. Because how do you explain to someone who was not there that D-Day was not glorious, that it was not heroic in the way people imagine, that it was terrifying and brutal and chaotic, that men died in ways that were senseless and random? That survival was mostly luck, that the real heroes are the ones who did not come home, the ones whose names are carved on memorials, the ones who never got the chance to have families or careers or lives beyond that beach. He will keep the Bronze Star they awarded him in a drawer unopened, will never display his medals or talk about his combat decorations, because he does not feel like a hero, feels more like a survivor of a disaster, someone who lived through something that should have killed him and cannot quite understand why he was spared. He will attend one reunion of his division in 1955, will reconnect with some of the men who survived D-Day, and they will sit together in a hotel bar and not talk about the war but not talk about anything else either, because what else is there to talk about that matters compared to what they went through together? And Robert will leave that reunion knowing that he will not attend another one because seeing these men brings everything back too vividly, makes Omaha Beach too real. And he cannot afford to let those memories overwhelm him because he has a wife and children who depend on him and a job that requires him to function normally. And so he will cut himself off from the only people who truly understand his experience, will choose isolation over connection because connection is too painful. Robert Hayes will live until 1998, dying at age 77 from heart disease that his doctors will say was caused by decades of stress and undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. And on his deathbed he will finally talk about Omaha Beach, will tell his children and grandchildren what it was really like, will describe the landing and the crawl across the beach and the deaths of his men. And he will cry as he talks, and his family will cry too, and he will say that he is glad they know now, glad that someone finally knows the truth, but he will also say that he wishes they did not have to know, wishes they could remain innocent of such knowledge. Because there are some things that once known cannot be unknown, and Omaha Beach is one of those things. But on this night, on the evening of June 6, 1944, as he sleeps fitfully in a captured German bunker on the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach, Robert Hayes is simply a 23-year-old lieutenant who survived the longest day, who led men through the worst fighting of the war so far, who killed enemy soldiers and watched his friends die, and who will have to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Because this is war. And war does not stop for grief or trauma or exhaustion. War just continues relentlessly forward until one side wins and the other loses, and all any individual soldier can do is survive one more day, make it through one more battle, and hope that eventually the war will end and he can go home and try to forget what he has seen and done, though of course he never will, because Omaha Beach is not something you forget, it is something you carry with you every day for the rest of your life. A weight that never gets lighter, a memory that never fades, a price paid for victory that cannot be measured in medals or promotions or historical significance but only in the faces of the men who died and the knowledge that their sacrifice made possible the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. And that is something, that has to be something, that has to mean that their deaths were not in vain. Even though Robert Hayes will wonder about that question for the rest of his life and never find an answer that satisfies him.